Webinar on passing state legislation to improve child nutrition programs. Today's topic is an exciting one because state legislation has the power to make significant and lasting changes to school and out of school time nutrition programs and ensure that children receive the healthy snacks and meals they need to learn and thrive. As Nomi said, my name is Alexis Bylander and I'm a senior policy analyst at FRAC. With me today are three excellent speakers: Anna Corson with Full Plates, Full Potential in Maine, Ashley Wieland with Hunger Free Colorado, and Julia Gross with Maryland Hunger Solutions. We are in a very significant moment in time right now as the COVID-19 pandemic continues and with the federal government potentially investing billions of dollars to address food insecurity and poverty through the budget reconciliation process if they can get their bills over the finish line. But while changes may be made at the federal level in the near future to bolster the child nutrition programs, there will no doubt still be a role for state legislation to fill gaps, address state-specific challenges, and think even bigger than the federal government about addressing food insecurity. Over the next hour, you'll hear about the experiences of Maine, Colorado, and Maryland, and their journeys to build relationships with policymakers, develop coalitions, and lay the groundwork for passing impactful bills to improve the access and quality of their school, after-school, and summer nutrition programs. As you consider legislation you'd like to pass in your own state, know that FRAC is here to support you. We track child nutrition legislation that passes in states, and I will share a link to our legislative chart in an email after this webinar. We also stand ready to help you develop legislative language or strategize around your policy campaigns. So let's get started. As the speakers present, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box and they will answer them as they're able. And if we have time for questions at the end, we will take those. So Anna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And a big thanks to FRAC for inviting me to share Maine's experience today. I really hope it's helpful in your state child nutrition policy efforts. So I'm Anna Corson. I'm the Advocacy Director with Full Plates, Full Potential here in Maine. Maine recently passed historic legislation to provide school meals at no cost to all students, regardless of their family's income. So I'm going to share a little bit about the journey that helped us arrive in this monumental place and the work that we still need to do, which we do still have some work to do here in Maine. So I'll start with a brief history of our policy and advocacy work and then get into more specifics around the key strategies that helped in moving school meals for all forward. And I just want to note that so much of our success had to do with good timing, as we currently have a friendly political climate in our state, as well as the pandemic response from USDA, allowing for school meals to be served at no cost. And this legislation could never have passed without the strong relationships that we've developed over time with key partners and stakeholders across the state and across the nation. Next slide, please. Or actually, stay on the slide that you're on. You were already there. Thank you. So Full Plates, Full Potential is a statewide nonprofit organization in Maine working to address childhood food insecurity by strengthening and expanding child nutrition programs like school breakfast, school lunch, after-school meals, and summer meals. We originated from a legislative task force, which was a coalition of child and hunger advocates, school nutrition professionals, and policymakers tasked to examine the state of childhood food insecurity in Maine and report back to the legislature with recommendations. Next slide, please. And since our inception, Full Plates and our coalition of partners have worked collaboratively and focused on state policy as a way to increase participation in child nutrition programs. And our coalition and partners have just grown over the years. Next slide, please. So we have passed laws that require high needs districts and communities to provide summer meals, after school meals, and breakfast after the bell. Our breakfast after the bell bill also has funding allocated. There's a state grant program to support schools to start and grow breakfast after the bell programs. We eliminated the reduced price category for both breakfast and lunch. So now all students eligible for a reduced price meal at school receive it at no cost, and the state picks up the bill. We also funded a farm to school incentive program. So schools can get $1 for every $3 they spend on local foods. Next slide, please. And I just love to share these photos because for decades leading up to this moment in time, school nutrition professionals in our state have been speaking to state and federal leaders about the need to feed all kids at no cost. They really started the conversation, and we were able to jump off of years and years of hard work and advocacy that they had put in. So this photo is at the Maine State House with former Governor King, now Senator King. Next slide, please. And this is in DC with Senator Cohen. And we really have used every child nutrition bill that we introduced as an opportunity to keep the conversation going around school meals and the importance of serving them at no cost. So even though this was the first time we introduced a School Meals for All bill, we had been laying the groundwork for years. Next slide, please. So this past session, we introduced a School Meals for All bill along with 4 other bills. We really had lofty goals. So in addition to School Meals for All, we worked to expand the existing local food incentive program. So it was formerly just an incentive program for local produce. So we expanded upon that to include other local foods like value-added dairy, protein, eggs, minimally processed produce. Before it had to be raw and unprocessed. So really expanded upon that, and that was all based on feedback that we received from school nutrition staff. We also worked on a 30-minute lunch mandate, which didn't pass, but also wasn't killed, this was not the first time we had introduced a 30-minute lunch mandate. So this has turned into a study of whether or not it's feasible for school districts to allow 30 minutes for kids to eat lunch. We also moved further on getting a statewide online school meal application. So we have a state-funded online application that a lot of school districts use, and there's a link to it on our State Department of Education's website. However, there's still work to be done there as it's not used by all school districts, and the data isn't accepted by all school districts when families input their family income data into it. So we still have work to do to make it truly a statewide online school meal application. And then also in response to the fact that school meal applications are a barrier to access for kids who may be eligible and haven't filled out an application, there's a lot of stigma attached. There's just a lot of issues surrounding school meal applications and the rate that they're returned by families. And that just became even more prevalent during the pandemic while meals were being served at no cost. There was no longer the incentive to fill out a school meal application. So we introduced a law that would require the Department of Education to study new ways, alternative ways to collect family income data. This was important since we were also introducing a School Meals for All bill. Next slide, please. So the bill language for School Meals for All that we helped to draft was pretty simple, and we modeled it after the previous bills that had eliminated the reduced price category. So it's basically that all children in public schools will be served meals at no cost to them, and the state will cover the difference between the price of a paid meal and the federal reimbursement for a free meal for any student ineligible to receive a free meal. And I'll be sure to follow up with FRAC with our bill language, so folks can look at that after the webinar. Next slide, please. And so I'd love to share some of the key strategies that we used leading up to and during the legislative session that really helped to move this bill forward. So some of these included working with a team of experienced lobbyists that have deep ties to Maine policymakers and history working on food insecurity and child nutrition. We also took every opportunity that we could find to talk about the importance of school meals and why they should be served at no cost to all students. And this included presenting at many conferences like the Maine Public Health Association, the Maine Principals Association, our Superintendents Association. So really being able to speak to, lots of different stakeholders and different audiences. We gave briefings to legislative leadership and key legislative committees. We also gave briefings to other decision makers like the governor's office and Maine's Commissioner of Education. We met with the editorial boards from the two big statewide daily newspapers in the state, and both ended up writing opinion pieces endorsing our bill. And we equipped our partners and stakeholders from various sectors with talking points and lots of opportunities to raise their voices in support of the bill. And these folks included educators, public health professionals, people working in healthcare, hunger advocates, school nutrition professionals, and students and parents. And we created template emails that they could send to their legislators. We drafted an online petition for folks to sign on to that just really said, they supported school meals for all in Maine. And we helped to draft lots of letters to the editor and op-eds. We also prepped our partners and stakeholders from all of these various sectors to testify in support of the bill during the public hearing, and that included some student voices. We also worked with school and community leaders in target legislative districts to just start communicating regularly with their state senators and representatives, urging them to support the bill. And we also worked with legislative leadership on both sides of the aisle to be vocal champions for the bill. And we really did our best to capitalize on the supportive political climate that we have in our state right now. So we early on reached out to our state Senate president and the Speaker of the Maine House and asked if they would consider leading on this bill. So Senate President was the lead sponsor, and the Speaker of the Maine House was the lead co-sponsor. We also worked with a Senate Republican who was in leadership, and he could speak to his own experience, remembering when he was a kid and he relied on school meals, and he really became key to the passage of this bill. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we had some key talking points that really seemed to resonate with decision makers. So some of these included that school meals are at no cost now during the pandemic, and we just can't go back to expecting some kids to pay. We talked a lot about the fact that food insecurity and family life are complicated and that they're not tied to income alone. And we were able to connect this issue to the opioid epidemic that is really ravaging Maine families. We pointed to the fact that school meals are the only part of the school day that some families are expected to pay for. We talked about the fact that providing school meals at no cost eliminates the deep stigma surrounding those meals and actually increases the number of students eating, especially those that need meals the most. And we said over and over and over that hungry children just can't learn, and really tied it to academic outcomes. And this was important as our governor introduced a budget package during the session that included an historic investment in public education. So we were really able to latch onto that and enforce the idea that any investment in our public schools should include an investment that ensures all kids have access to school breakfast and lunch. Otherwise, that big investment in public education might be wasted on hungry kiddos. And it also was very important to hear the expertise from impacted people. So we did the best we could to include current and former students who have experienced stigma or are experiencing hunger. Also working with school nutrition staff and teachers who see the faces of food insecure children in their schools every day, and also children who just really need a meal because they're in school for 6+ hours. And those stories from on the ground and the personal experience really resonated with decision makers and really spoke to why this was such an important piece of policy. So ultimately, our bill passed through the legislature with resounding bipartisan support, but it was not fully funded. So our appropriations committee was able to come up with $10 million as a part of the budget package being introduced. So they started a seed fund with the hope that a lot of the pieces that have been moving at the federal level would help to expand free meals federally. We, of course, hope that too. Next slide, please. And so now we are focusing our advocacy efforts on our members of Congress. We've been urging them to support school meals for all at the federal level. And right now, we are very focused on the proposed expansion of the Community Eligibility Provision, which would reduce Maine's contribution to school meals for all. So some of our next steps include working with our governor and the legislature this fall to secure the rest of the funding needed to provide school meals for all Maine kids. So we expect another budget package to be introduced, and we are working to get the rest of the funding in that budget. So we are working on a new fiscal estimate. We know that there are, as I mentioned, federal changes that could decrease Maine's commitment, but we still need anywhere between $15 and $25 million in our state budget every year to make school meals for all a reality. We're also planning a virtual week-long celebration of school meals during National School Lunch Week, and we're working with the governor's office and legislative leadership to participate and recognize the importance of school meals and Maine's historic law. We've also been doing extensive outreach to families to encourage them to submit their school meal applications to ensure that Maine schools can maximize federal reimbursements. We're doing this through a coordinated statewide social media campaign with weekly posts throughout September that are being posted on all sorts of social media platforms by our many statewide partners. And we've also placed targeted ads that are linked to all Maine statewide daily newspapers, their online editions. So this is another way that we're really encouraging families to fill out their school meal applications. We've also been doing some outreach to schools to adopt the Community Eligibility Provision, which would help to lower Maine's state funding contribution and would maximize federal funding. And we are working with partners to promote school meal participation. So we do this through a lot of positive promotion. We highlight local food in schools, and we really are working to change the perception of school meals and the stigma around them. And we have grant programs tied to school breakfast after the bell and after school meals. And we have put out some funding already this year, and we'll have another round of grants later on in the year. And we also work with some retired school nutrition directors who now work as consultants, and they provide support and technical assistance to school nutrition programs who are implementing new policies, starting new programs like breakfast after the bell or an after school meal program, and then just general help and support during this very challenging school year. So that's all I had to share today. And if you have any questions for me, please put them in the chat or in the question and answer section, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. So thank you so much. I appreciate the time to share.
Thank you so much, Anna. I always love hearing about the work that you do to engage a variety of stakeholders, and also all the time and effort you put into really getting some great earned media around your campaign. I think what I've learned from you is that to be able to pass your school meals for all legislation, you had a favorable political environment, but you wouldn't have been able to seize that opportunity if you hadn't put in all of the legwork ahead of time to build partnerships and really be ready for that. So I love hearing the Maine story. Thank you. So up next, let's move to Colorado, and Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Sorry, getting some technical stuff fixed here. The video taking a second to start.
Yep, no
Hi,
problem.
everybody. I wish we were as far along as Maine. We are not. So we are probably like a lot of states, folks from different states on this call that want to do this. But we have been working probably for about 6 months to start the process. And so I'm going to talk about where we are in it, and love to get, more conversations going with many of you on what you all are up to. Colorado has done some policy work in the past prior to me on school meals. One is our state covers the copays that are required. So that was one step forward. But our state has a ways to go. And so we're starting that conversation. And as Anna said, a lot of it is because what's happening at the federal level created this moment in time where many states can consider. And now with what the Congress is considering, we may be able to do more. If you want to go to the next slide. So a little bit about what I have in slides here. I have to also thank my boss, Mark Jacobson. I work really close with him, and he actually is the brain behind the first version of this. So if there's any edit mistakes, they're mine, so blame me. But overview is we want healthy school meals for all in Colorado. I'll go over a little bit of the national policy context, which is helping push us forward, a little bit about our work over the last 6 months. And then what we see is our policy options. We have a few, and we're still trying to figure out which ones to take. And then what we see is the timeline. If you want to go to the next slide. So our version for healthy school meals for all looks like Maine's, I think. Like we want free school meals for all students statewide. We want resources to support healthy food and locally sourced food. We did a listening session with some promotoras that we've worked with on pandemic, EBT, and many of your parents. And they said, yeah, we want school meals for all, but we want food that our kids want to eat. And so it's really important that we have healthy, food that families want. And then we want to make sure that youth and parents and children have a voice in what is being, what they're being fed and how the school programs are being made. So trying to build that into what we work on policy-wise. And another piece that we're starting to talk about too is also, and it sounds like I think California used this messaging in their passage and probably in their policy, is to support this the nutrition workers. In our state, the folks that work in our nutrition departments on the front lines are some of the worst paid in our schools, and we need to change that. We need there to be living wages and people to be able to do a job that they love to do, including serving and feeding our kids healthy food. If you want to go to the next slide. So the national policy context, you all are experts on it. We have been meeting with our delegation, mostly the friendly folks at the congressional level, to really, our goal was to get school meals for all into the package. A lot of you on our calls nationally, have also been advocating for that. So that's been our starting line. We have been able to get a few Colorado members to support that and to sign on to the Sanders bill. There's a lot to be done in the recovery package. And we are really excited that these fixes to the CEP provision are in it. We think it will make it a lot more affordable for Colorado. And just some, I guess that might be the next slide, but this is a lot of repetitive, but Colorado is not in the Medicaid pilot for ISPs direct certification. And so that we think that could make a huge difference, but we're also know that getting that data, Colorado's data systems are messed up, like many states probably, because of lack of resources to update them. And so we are on, the other piece for making CEP work for our state will be helping in our state being able to get the Medicaid data into the ISP calculations. And it could take more than, a year. Our state decided not to apply for the opening of the pilot because of that issue. And I think, for all of us, I'm hoping that we'll see some national advocacy and our advocacy across the country to say we need another year of school meals for all to actually implement these ideas and these policies that are in the national bill, because Colorado won't be able to implement these CEP changes as quickly as possible. And then that would mean we'd have a gap in schools who could be continuing school meals for all. So some federal advocacy that we're seeing is going to be needed to make this work in Colorado. If you want to go to the next slide. And then Susan asked how much we figured it will cost. It's really hard for us to determine how much the cost will be. We've, Mark on the back of his hand and has figured, about 150 million without the CEP fixes for Colorado. And it's kind of based on California's own fiscal analysis and what they did in their bill. in their budget, actually. But with us having Medicaid certification, if this recovery plan passes, as well as the 2.5 reimbursement multiplier, that would actually really change the ballgame from the full cost of what school meals would be for Colorado. I hope it's a third of the cost we would have now, and that will help us a lot in our state policy conversations. So over the last 6 months, we've been working to really build our relationships with the education community. The hunger folks have been pretty differentiated as of late. They used to be, I think, more crossed, and then as of late haven't been. And so we have a coalition of folks that come together to actually fix Colorado. Their goal is to fix Colorado's budget to help schools overall. So we've joined that coalition and started educating them on school meals for all and what's going on at the federal level and the opportunities. We have an awesome consultant, Emily Pia, who has been doing a lot of CEP outreach to school districts about that opportunity. And we actually found a lot of schools said, we're not going to apply. We have school meals for all right now. So, we were hoping a lot more districts would consider it this year, and they're in a waiting limbo. And then I think now with what could happen at Congress, a lot more, we were hoping, a lot more will qualify with the Medicaid changes, as well as that, it not being, when we get to not having school meals for all, even though I want it for one more year. We are part of a group that works with a Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council that the governor appoints. And so that group did a brief on the importance of universal meals. So really building the case in any way we can, we're trying to do. And I mentioned the federal advocacy, really trying to make CEP work the best that we can. And then we've been having lots of meetings with different stakeholders we've been looking at how other states and who have been part of their coalitions and meeting with stakeholders with ideas on that. So the healthcare community, the children's health community, the education community, the unions, all sorts of types to really get them to understand what school meals for all could mean, and that we have this opportunity right now. If you want to go to the next slide. The next steps is we're educating Colorado leaders, so our legislature, on the opportunity. So we've been meeting with our budget folks at the legislature, but there is, and then building an initial coalition, like I said, with those conversations with groups. But Colorado, like a lot of states, we determine our at-risk funding based on free and reduced lunch applications. So that's been a huge barrier and a reason why a lot of schools haven't participated in CEP, as well as CEP, our budget's so bad, CEP might be a cost to them that they can't afford. And they also can't afford to not collect free and reduced lunch applications with the formula being based on that. So we're working, we have a committee right now looking at that from our legislature, and we're working with our partners who have other reasons, but we to not support that at-risk funding being based on FRL, but we know that it would be a lot easier to do school meals for all and use CEP to do it if we didn't have our at-risk funding based on that. So yeah, I've given my 2 cents, Anna, to several of the budget members, and I'm going to continue to. So we will see, we've looked at Texas's model for school meals or for determining at-risk funding, but if anyone has great ideas for how to do that, that would be helpful. So the next piece is we have to decide on what it looks like. Colorado has no money. We're the state that has that horrible taxpayer bill of rights. So we can't increase our taxes without a vote of the people. And we can't change how have progressive taxes or anything unless we change our constitution, which is also a vote of the people and pretty strict ways to do it. So we have this extra barrier of our budget in Colorado. I mean, I think most states do, but we have Tabor as well as another piece. So we have to decide if we're going to go to the ballot or if we're going to work through it with the legislature. And really that will be decided based on what Congress passes next month. So I think we could be in some really good shape to go the legislative route, or maybe a legislative referred measure if the package passes as it is. So, Alexis and others at FRAC, thank you for getting that statewide option in. I'm hoping that's how we can go, but we'll see based on what happens with that package. But that's the process of where we're at right now, is talking to our legislators and educating them on this is the moment. that the feds will pay for more, that it'll be affordable for us, and that we've seen who a pandemic and other emergencies hurt the most. It's parents with kids at home, it's low-income communities, and that's who it's going to impact the most. We're also talking a lot about the cliffs that are coming with emergency aid, with pandemic aid, and that we don't want one of the cliffs to be school meals for kids in Colorado. Once we decide on the policy, which we think we'll do by the end of November or so, we'll wait till the election this time around happens, we'll be building our campaign based on if it's a legislative campaign or a ballot initiative campaign or combined. It could be combined. Next slide. Try not to, I didn't see Alexis when I started, so let me know if I'm way over. And I basically just went over this, so we can go to the next slide. One more slide. So this is our timeline. I don't know if some of your states have similar timelines, if you're seeing this as an opportunity at the moment, especially with that state CEP option. So right now we're doing internal research. Emily, who I mentioned, has been talking to schools about CEP, is actually doing a survey of our school district nutrition directors on if they want universal meals and what they need for that. And the biggest barrier we're seeing is that that at-risk funding, and their fear that they would lose some of that funding if they weren't collecting free and reduced lunch applications. So that backs up some of the work we're going to be doing at the legislature over the next few months to not count at-risk funding that way. Right now, we're working on a poll that will go out into the field in the next week or two to see where voters in Colorado are on this issue, as well as the different ideas to fund it. There are different ways we can fund it. We could do an income tax. You know, there's conversations about if regressive and progressive taxes. We could do something that's harder, a constitutional ballot initiative that would require to do a progressive tax. We could look at fees, and we could look at, tax loopholes that are in place that we could end with our legislature. So we're also testing all of that with voters about how they'd be okay with us paying for this. October and November, I actually have to say, we'll make some decisions on which option to go through. And if it's legislative, it could take a couple years. We're realistic about, we hope we can pass it this year, but we don't have quite the work behind us that Maine does. So there's some base building to do. December through May, we'll be working on passing the bill if it's a referred measure or we're able to pay for it through the legislature, and creating our campaign. So we need to raise dollars, which is a big piece of this, is raising enough dollars to have a ballot initiative. So that will be a big component, as well as hiring a campaign manager or company to oversee it and really putting together a ballot initiative campaign. Colorado, we're a ballot initiative state, and a few of us at Hunger Free before we got here did that kind of work. So we will be creating if we have to go through ballot initiative, we'll be creating a campaign and creating a structure for that. And then in November, that's when the election will be. And through all of this, there's a lot of politics and political strategies to think about as we do it. But we feel like the moment is now, like I'm sure a lot of you feel like the moment is now, with what we've learned and actually what has been proven that we all know from the pandemic of who's most impacted, as well as the Congress putting in more dollars into helping states get further along and getting closer to this goal. So fingers crossed we can get to where Maine and California have gotten. But it's a really big lift, but an exciting lift. And our staff were just meeting the other day, and we were talking about the importance of, that we're doing this because we want to make a difference and we want to help families. And I think that's the right values to have behind the goals that many of you also have with this work. So I think that's it for me.
Well, thanks, Ashley. You are really in the thick of it in your policy work right now. And I think a lot of states in this meeting can relate to that. And also, I'm glad that you mentioned Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, because that's really unique. And while that might not exist in other states, many states might have something that is a unique challenge to their work. And I think it's helpful for them to hear that you have something like that too, that you're managing and working around. So thank you. All right, well, our last speaker for today is Julia. I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Alexis, and thanks for having me on this call. I always love being a part of these webinars to hear about the lofty goals of other states. I feel like we're in such good company. So I'm really glad to be a part of this and be able to give a little bit of history on Maryland's legislation. So as Alexis said, my name is Julia Gross. I am one of the Anti-Hunger Program Associates at Maryland Hunger Solutions. And I work specifically on the child nutrition programs. So everything from school meals to summer and after school, as well as WIC and pandemic EBT. So kind of the whole spectrum. And we can go to the next slide. So Maryland Hunger Solutions is a nonpartisan nonprofit established as a statewide initiative of FRAC. So we work to end hunger and food insecurity, as well as improving nutrition and the well-being of individuals, children, and families in Maryland. We do that by creating a self-sustaining connection between Maryland residents and nutritious food. So a huge part of that is working to remove the barriers to state and federal nutrition programs, as well as other key anti-poverty support programs. So that participants participation can grow, and those who need those supports the most can access them. So we know that Maryland has a fairly stable history of being one of the wealthiest states in the country, but we also know that poverty and food insecurity still exist here, and they exist in every single one of our districts. So from our Eastern Shore to Western Maryland and the greater DC metro area, up into the suburbs of Baltimore, it doesn't really matter what the average income level is. We have families and communities that struggle to keep food on the table. And so knowing that, education is a huge component of our work. Sharing with policymakers and our greater public kind of the reality of that food insecurity in our state. And then, of course, another huge component of our work involves striving to improve public policies. So whether that's through conversations with state agencies, sharing best practices with program providers, or working through legislation, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and actually introducing the bills and passing state legislation. So I'm by no means going to touch on every single policy that we've worked on, but I did want to touch on kind of three key pieces that I think really showcase some of our strategy when we're considering our legislative changes. So the first bill I want to talk about is the Hunger Free Schools Act. So this was way back in 2015. This was our CEP expansion bill. So helping to remove barriers to CEP by holding districts harmless with regards to qualifying for state compensatory funding based on farms forms alone. So when this bill passed, we actually only had 3 districts that were using community eligibility. So we had 2 schools in Howard County, a handful in Washington County, and then the whole district of Somerset. And for those who aren't familiar with our geography, Washington County and Howard are kind of middle of the state. Somerset is on the Eastern Shore, but all of them look very different in terms of size and income levels. Howard County is actually one of the wealthiest counties in Maryland. So we knew going in that if there are eligible schools in that district, that there were going to be so many more schools and students that could benefit from CEP. We were right. So as of last school year, we actually now have 367 CEP schools in Maryland, covering 172,000 students, and 3 districts that are completely CEP district-wide, so Somerset, Dorchester, and then the whole city of Baltimore. So that was a great stepping stone bill for us. The next bill I wanted to mention is the Maryland Cares for Kids Act. So this is the one that eliminated our reduced price copay, which we know is something that we don't have to worry about in CEP schools, but for the rest of the state, this represented a huge step forward, and I think is a huge step towards what we've all mentioned on this call and all are working towards, is finally getting to that healthy school meals for all time where we can just provide meals to all students at no cost. And then finally, we have our school meal charge policy bill, which actually passed right under the wire before the pandemic shut everything down in 2020. So this bill set a standard for all districts when it came to meal charge policies to eliminate stigmatizing practices, set communication requirements with households, improved meal application outreach, and also put a nutrition standard on the alternative meals that are served, so no student is getting just a cold cheese sandwich. And you can go ahead and hit the next slide. So in terms of timing and strategy, the reason that we went for all of these bills, everything was based on real world challenges that we know exist because we've seen them across all of our work on a daily basis. So these policy changes were ways to make real world impact in addressing these issues. And that's really behind the driving force behind all of our work, not just of creating change for change's sake, but really rooting our work in what we see in our communities and what our communities are facing on a daily basis. And so in addressing that, we recognize that the root cause of hunger is poverty, and often an unstated impact is race and how that plays into the systemic inequities. So working families with children in that reduced price category are often disproportionately our communities of color, and they have real life challenges of outside of paying for school meals. And we recognize that there's no reason a single mother making less than $30,000 a year should have to pay for school meals. There's no reason why she shouldn't have those meals provided for her kids. That's not enough to live off of in most places, and especially in Maryland with the high cost of living. And so if we can create a system and policy changes so that no one's falling through the cracks, that we're providing as many meals as we can, that's a huge burden lifted off those families, and that's really powerful. So as we work towards these goals, we do that by sharing the stories that we hear. So education through storytelling as much as we can. We rely on the voices of those with lived experiences. Although I think when it comes especially to kids and school meals, most likely those stories are going to be told through us secondhand or through those parents. So for example, I have a story from our school meal debt bill. So we were contacted right before we started working on this bill. We were contacted by a single mother who was on SNAP, meaning her second grade daughter would have been receiving school meals for free. And she reached out to us because she had just learned that there was an error in the school system, and she had school meal debt. So there was debt added through no fault of her own to her daughter's account, which the school system unfortunately didn't communicate properly. And so for an entire month, her daughter would go to school, pick out her meal, only to have it thrown away and replaced with a cold cheese sandwich. So we know that there's no making up for that kind of trauma, but there are things that we can do to make sure that that story never happens again. And so we share those instances to educate policymakers on the importance of these programs, and not only to improve lives now, but also set the stage for greater change and bigger impacts. And I think that's one of the key components of education in terms of, it's easy to understand the theory behind all of these changes, but sometimes it's just that, and it's only theoretical until it's made personal through these stories. And then sharing the impact of all of these programs is really critical as well. So I mentioned we had 3 CEP districts before our CEP legislation. 2 of the stories are quotes really that we love to share from some of the testimony during that time. The first was from the superintendent of Somerset County. I mean, he said that CEP was the best decision he ever made as an educator, which I think is absolutely huge. And then the second story is also from Somerset. They had an attendance policy where students would be sanctioned if they either came in late or missed school. And the year after implementing CEP district-wide, they had no attendance sanctions in their school. So I think that's a really powerful message to help share that, school meals might not be the complete answer to that, but it absolutely made a huge difference in the lives of the students in that county. So you can go ahead and hit into the next slide. So like both Maine and Colorado, we absolutely could not do any of the work that we do without our partners. And so I think we absolutely share the message of collaborating across sectors. So as I mentioned, we all know the root cause of food insecurity is poverty. There's so many facets to that challenge and barriers faced by those experiencing poverty. And so having partners in all sectors is really critical. And having space for everyone to come together and kind of brainstorm creative solutions to all facets of that is really critical. So I wanted to mention two of the events that we hold annually to help facilitate those conversations and create a space for partners to come together. The first is our annual legislative brainstorming session. So we hold that every year to bring together people from across all sectors and policymakers, community members, stakeholders, researchers, anyone who is interested in coming up with legislative solutions to food insecurity, and we hold a space around conversations to kind of bring up new and innovative ideas to implement in the upcoming legislative session. And then we also co-chair the Maryland Food Access and Nutrition Network, and so through that we hold network calls in an annual conference, which unfortunately hasn't happened since COVID. But prior to COVID was a really great space for everyone across the state to meet in person for a day and hold those conversations as well and learn from each other. And then that last piece there brings some expertise. So I think it's been really critical being tapped into the FRAC network. That's been a huge part of learning from FRAC and other states about what's going on kind of outside of ourselves and bringing that back to our partners. And that really helps facilitate a stronger relationship too. And then in terms of reports, we have a handful of reports that we publish on an annual basis to help share that information as well, kind of what's going on in our state, help share best practices and participation numbers. And I know, particularly legislators love hearing about what's going on in their district. So that's been a really great way to build rapport with them. Next slide. All right, and then lessons learned. So I think, like Colorado, we're not quite to healthy school meals for all yet, but we recognize that that is the greatest goal, the greater goal that we've had all along the way. And we've been able to take really important incremental steps, and we've had, specific asks that go along with the challenges that we've seen across our state and the stories that we've heard. But, it's never enough and it's never fast enough. And so I think just learning from that and seeing all of the impact that these incremental steps have had, that's kind of something that we can hold on to as we move towards, having healthy school meals for all and hopefully getting to a point where we can provide for all of the students across our state. And then, of course, looking for new innovative ways of thinking and solution to a lot of these challenges. So I think we've seen a lot of that come through with kind of components from the pandemic and all of the changes that our programs have seen throughout this past year and a half. So really using that as a springboard. I mean, I think we can all agree that we don't want to take any steps backwards. And so, kind of holding on to the progress that's made and really building off of that and expanding what's already been established. And I think you can head to the next slide. That's just a wrap-up slide from Maryland. I did include my email address and our website. So our website has all of our reports and testimony if anyone is interested in that. And then I did mention our brainstorming session. Of course, if anyone's interested in attending one of those, we have set up for October, so you can just reach out to me and I can share the registration link if when we have it.
All right, well, thanks, Julia. I really like how you highlighted the importance of sharing stories as part of advocacy work and putting real world examples out there as the face of systemic problems. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. If people in this session have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box or in the chat. There is one question out there, how will we receive a copy of this presentation? We have been recording this session and we will post it online and send a link out to everyone who participated today, along with resources that were mentioned throughout the presentations. So I'm just going to take, okay, here's a question for Anna. How will Maine evaluate the universal school lunch program?
That's
I'll give Anna.
Okay.
Yeah,
I know technology lagged for just a second there. Great question. So we actually were fortunate that we were approached by a research team at the Harvard School of Nutrition. They are working with folks in California and also in Maine to look at how this legislation will impact students in Maine and California. And then they're going to be doing a comparison study with a district in Anchorage, Alaska, where students are currently receiving school meals at no cost based on the USDA waivers, and what happens when that goes away. So being able to compare Maine and California that will be continuing to feed kids at no cost. So that's really exciting, and it's really, we're not doing it, we're just helping to inform some of the pieces that they'll be looking at. So we're excited to be a part of that evaluation.
I'm so glad that that question got asked, and Anna, that you were able to answer it, because the evaluation results from Maine could very well in the future be helpful to other states to show great outcomes and help pass legislation in their states. So that's good. All right, I'm just checking the chat box here one more time. Oh, here's another one. We've been interested in Alaska in eliminating the reduced price copay for families. Great to see what other states have done in this area. So I guess more of a comment than a question, but thank you for that, Kara. So with that, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. I just want to thank again Anna, Ashley, and Julia for their contributions today, and everyone for joining. My contact information is on this slide if you have any follow-up questions. And again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email. So everybody have a great rest of the afternoon. Take care.